Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar hosted by Drug Free America Foundation and the National Drug Free Workplace Alliance and supported through the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association. The program today is entitled Marijuana in the Workplace. My name is Karen Bellinger, and I'm the Program Director for Drug Free America Foundation. A few housekeeping items. We encourage you to write your questions for our panelists this morning in the Q&A box. And the final 10 minutes or so will be devoted to responding to your questions. The webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a link to it along with the PowerPoint presentation and a certificate following the webinar. The survey will be sent also following the webinar. Please complete it as soon as possible. So let's get started. Here's a brief bio on our presenter, Jo McGuire. As the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association's Executive Director, Jo is responsible for the day-to-day management of the association and for implementing its strategic vision under the guidance of the Board of Directors and committees. She's a nationally respected advocate for safe and drug-free workplaces, families, and communities with more than 10 years of experience in the drug and alcohol testing industry. Jo was appointed to serve on the Taxation, Banking, and Civil Law Work Group for the Governor's Task Force to regulate Amendment 64 in Colorado due to her expertise in the fields of workplace drug and alcohol testing, and represented the industry during the United Nations General Assembly and World Drug Agreements. As a recognized subject matter expert, Jo is a highly respected national conference speaker, writer, and public policy advisor. Welcome, Jo.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you so much to Drug Free America for having me present today. I'm so pleased to be here with you all. And we have a lot of material to cover, so I'm just going to jump right in. What I'd like to cover with you today are what is trending in drug use that impacts the workplace, particularly pertaining to marijuana, the outcomes and challenges that this is presenting as far as employers and employees go. And then specifically employers' rights and responsibilities. What can we do about it, right? Those are the things that we want to understand. And I think it behooves us to stop for a moment and have a minute of reflection on this incident that occurred in 1987. Why are we going backwards in time? Well, we have as most of you know, a body of law that governs most of the procedural kind of aspect of drug testing in the United States under CFR 49 Part 40, and this would be the U.S. Department of Transportation Omnibus Act that protects transportation safety workers and the public with a robust drug testing program. And I want you to understand where that program came from. In 1987, we had a railroad engineer, Ricky Gates, and his brakeman who got into a train running light, which means they were running empty. These two gentlemen doing what they did in the 80s, I guess, they decided to partake of some marijuana, some cannabis, and smoke some pot at the train depot before they got into their engine. And when they then proceeded toward their destination, they missed signal after signal after signal driving down the tracks. Unbeknownst to them, the signals that they were missing to stop, to brake, to divert, to get on another set of tracks, were trying to tell them that there was a passenger train that had just left the station in Washington, D.C., full of holiday travelers coming back from vacation and holiday breaks and visiting trips at the end of the holidays in January, going back so the kids could start school, the parents could return to work. And with that in mind, they crashed into that passenger train. On that day, this was the worst rail tragedy that had occurred in the United States with fatalities at that time. The engineer of the passenger train was killed, as well as 16 other individuals. And that included women, men, families, children. It was a terrible tragedy, and over 100 and 60 people were injured. Some of them still suffer those injuries to this day. Why is this important? Because it was this event right here that triggered the President of the United States at that time, Ronald Reagan, to implement the Omnibus Act and to say to Congress, who had been fighting and finagling over whether or not to drug test for several years, and the president said, get it done. And this began drug testing across the United States for safety sensitive employees, such as your airline pilots, your school bus drivers, your over the road truck haulers, pipeline and hazardous waste, nuclear regulatory control, Coast Guard, etc. So, when we look back at the history of workplace drug testing and all of those programs that don't have anything to do with DOT, which is 80% of the rest of the employers in the United States, we follow this model, and it all happened because of marijuana. And I want us to be clear on that, because at that time in history, we had much lower potency of cannabis than we have today. So let's look at what we're dealing with now. Now we think it's a good idea to have legal marijuana in the states and to really fly against our federal law, and just to start implementing something that the federal government, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FDA, 6 different agencies have said is a problem because it's impairing. And yet we're kind of pretending like it's not. We're also pretending like it's the same potency of cannabis that we experienced back in the 80s, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But here, shortly after the state of Illinois legalized marijuana, they had a Cook County Forest Preserves worker who ran his dump truck. So a dump truck is a huge, heavy vehicle. He was under the influence of cannabis. He drove his truck at 76 miles per hour into a line of 5 vehicles that were stopped at a red light. You know why? Because his response time was off. He couldn't respond fast enough to realize that he needed to brake in a 30-mile-per-hour zone and that there were cars stopped in front of him. Here we have a CBS News article that talks about some of the types of jobs where you may or may not be able to expect that these employees will be under the influence. So clearly, food preparation, hospitality industry, service industries. But what I find interesting about this one is that we see law enforcement, we see school teachers, we see people who are in jobs we would not expect to use cannabis, who are pretty open about it and self-reporting. I want you to see that several years ago, when we were training in my industry, employers on how to detect the signs and symptoms of cannabis, these were the standards right here, right? Red eye, strong smell, problem with memory and learning, distorted perception, difficulty in problem solving. We have some physical and mental coordination, struggling with divided attention, diminished inability, or ability to concentrate. So this is the kind of thing that we all normally look at and go, yeah, well, is this person really, really that harmless? There might be some fatigue and paranoia. Mood alterations, we could see some impaired health and respiratory problems. Here is what we're now adding to this presentation with higher potency products: extreme paranoia, hallucinations, delusionary behavior that can turn violent, bursts of violence and rage, heart palpitations, increased risk of heart attack, anxiety, panic attacks, ER visits, right? The high is lasting sometimes for days rather than just a couple of hours. We really don't know how long the impairment's going to last, depending on what products the employees choose to use. So we've changed the game. How has that happened? What's going on there? What does that mean? And what other risks are there? Well, as we've increased the potency and the frequency of use, we now see a higher association in employees between levels of psychosis and their cannabis use, depending on, again, frequency and potency. In over 18 studies, we see over 66,000 individuals studied. Now, this is really significant, and I'm not going to spend too much time just like throwing science and this kind of thing at you because that can get kind of boring. But I really want you to understand the significance of 66,800 individuals. Usually in scientific studies, when we see 1,000 people that have the same type of reaction, we know we have something very significant in the data. When we see 10,000, it's considered incontrovertible evidence. This is 66,000 individuals who have higher levels of cannabis use associated with increased risk for psychotic breaks, and that they have outcomes that are dose response, have dose response relationships. And I want to just give you a little example of this from my own life. I have a niece who is now 31 years old. She's soon to be 32. When she was 22 years old, after never having used drugs in her life ever, just wasn't that kind of girl, was raised very sheltered in an extremely strict religious environment. She got connected with a guy at age 22 who tried to convince her, or did convince her, look, this is harmless. It's healthier for you than a glass of wine. It's better for you. It just helps you relax. It's medicine. And so she tried marijuana for the first time, actually on her 22nd birthday. Within 18 months, she was so addicted to this drug and using what we refer to as concentrates. And if you don't know what that is, I will show you that in a moment. She was living on marijuana edibles and using concentrates. She, at that point in 18 months, she weighed 78 pounds. And she was 23 and a half, almost to her 24th birthday. She had a complete and total psychotic break. She ended up in the emergency room, and then her heart stopped beating. So she had to be resuscitated. She was on no other drugs. They did a 250 panel tox test on her. Cannabis was the only thing present in her system. We had to get her into a rehabilitation center. We actually had to find 3 rehab centers because nobody knew how to treat her extreme situation. Now, the story didn't end there. This continued for 6 more years. She would get clean, then she would get on marijuana and have another psychotic break and get clean, and then have another psychotic break, always reaching out to me for help. We exhausted all of our resources until we finally had to send her to another state. But at 30 years of age, this young, smart, beautiful woman that I've known since her birth was declared a mentally incompetent adult by the state of Colorado, unable to care for herself or hold a job. And it is completely and totally a result of her cannabis use mixed with underlying mental health conditions. And we have a lot of people in our country today and around the world that struggle with mental health conditions. They think, and they're being told, that cannabis is a way to help alleviate that, when in fact it exacerbates that problem. And this is something that we have to look for in the workplace, because my niece's use 100% impacted her workplace, and she was fired from job after job after job because she would have these breakdowns, sometimes while at work. The first episode of psychosis due to high potency cannabis use, the risk is 5 times greater. Only weekend use nearly triples the risk. So we have to remember that people who think they're using this product to take the edge off, to solve their anxiety, etc., it is actually only creating a greater issue. We do have increased risk of stroke and this is really interesting. The 80% of those that are affected by this are men, average age 32. Now, why is this important in a workplace conversation? Because this is your workforce right here. 81% suffered a stroke within 24 hours following marijuana use. So for those who, again, may have underlying health conditions, they are going to have an increased risk of stroke after using cannabis. I just want to make sure and point out briefly that cannabis is not the solution for the prescription opioid problem that we have. In fact, many studies show us not only does it not affect to decrease, but actually can cause an increase. So let's move on. What is the impact in the workplace? Well, in the state of Colorado and the state of Washington, immediately after we legalized cannabis in 2012. 2012 was when we voted on it. 2013 is when it became legal for personal use. And then 2014 was when we opened up the massive retail market, right? So this 2014 data is for the year 2013 when personal use and possession became legal in those two states. And what we saw was that in 2012, both of those states were at the national average for drug test positivity of 6%. Okay, so both of those states had 6% positivity in 2012. In 2013, Colorado more than tripled that rate at 20%, and Washington State quadrupled that rate at 24% positivity. Just in the first year that legalization came into play, that doesn't take into account when the retail market opened up the next year. We continue to see that data climb, and I'll mention that here in just a moment. But in 2018, the state of Colorado did just a brief survey around the Denver area by a journalist. It's kind of like a pro marijuana brag, I guess you could say. Of 600 employees surveyed, 48% said I've gone to work high in the last 30 days. We do see 57% of marijuana users in the state of Colorado admit to driving within 2 hours of use. Now, lest they think the impairment window is smaller than 2 hours, they are definitely wrong. What we see is people legitimately think that this makes them a safer driver. And again, we really need to pay attention to our employees driving during work hours. Not are they a driver for the company, are they driving a company vehicle, but are they driving during work hours in the course of duties, going out to lunch? What does that look like? And if we don't have strong policies that protect the workplace, how could that impact you? The leading cause of death for workplace fatalities is driving impaired, distracted, and fatigued. So we need to remember that impaired driving is something that your workplace policy should cover. The National Transportation Safety Board stated that in 182 heavy truck crashes, 1/3 of the drivers tested positive for illicit drugs. Marijuana and alcohol were found the most frequently. Here we have a breakdown, which we can get annually in the National Survey of Drug Use and Health data, but we consistently see some of the occupations that have more positivity in their post-accident drug test than others. And of course, we'll see, again, going back to that other article, food services, the entertainment and recreation industry. I think it's interesting that management is up there, but that shows that sometimes a company is not choosing to drug test their managers. They're testing kind of like the lower level worker bees, but maybe foregoing management testing, thinking, well, why do we need to test them? Well, when their positivity shows up on post-accident drug testing, that's a problem, et cetera. So you could see some of your blue collar, but then again, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's your white collar. Now, we have some great data from Quest Diagnostics Drug Test Index that shows us trends that have been happening for the last several years in our industry. They've actually been doing this study for decades. And what we've seen is that since that first year, 2012, where Colorado, Washington, and Oregon changed their laws, since that time, we've seen all illicit drug test positivity increase, and the highest rate in 10 years of over 10 million drug tests. So positivity continues to climb, which is distressing. If you look at what those drugs look like, it's not just marijuana. We're seeing amphetamines increase, benzodiazepines increase, but the purple line, of course, that's your THC, that's your marijuana. So, I mean, the positivity for marijuana absolutely is striking compared to all of the other drugs. Here's an interesting trend with federal motor carriers. Now, remember, when I told you the story of the Chase Conrail's Maryland train crash, I mentioned the U.S. Department of Transportation drug testing protocols and procedures, which are mandatory. There's absolutely zero tolerance for marijuana in that industry. And one of the primary qualifiers for that program are the truck drivers under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. However, in their recent clearinghouse database, which just started it was about 3 years ago in January, what we're seeing in that data is that positivity for cannabis is just absolutely over the top compared to any other drug. Now, that is still less than 5% of the entire workforce. It's actually probably less than 3% of the entire workforce in federal motor carriers. But when you look at those numbers, they are quite stark and shocking. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, drug and alcohol related deaths in the workplace soared in 2016 with a spike of more than 30% in a single year. These were the greatest numbers we'd seen in 10 years of safety programs in the U.S. So after we changed our laws, again, starting in 2012, it just took, and we changed in 2012, changes took effect in 2013. It only took 3 years for us to see our safety programs being unraveled. The Bureau of Labor Statistics also showed that fatal work injuries were the highest since 2008. Another problem that we're seeing, of course, is the job applicant issue. You have 12 applicants to show up. They see the drug test guy walk in with his kit and his shirt with his logo on. 9 applicants get up and walk out immediately. You've lost 75% of your applicants. 3 of those choose to complete the pre-employment drug screen. 2 pass, 1 fails. So 2 out of 12 are not great odds. And I think that's very common in what we see. We also have construction companies in Colorado who for these last 10 years have said, if we have a safety sensitive job and we need to be drug free because it's federal program and we have to abide by that. Sometimes we have to look outside the state for employees that can pass a drug test. I think these days that's even a struggle. Here in Southern Colorado, I live in Colorado Springs, so a lot of my data is Colorado, sort of the epicenter of these law changes, if you will. And the reason for that is because we changed our state constitution. We didn't just implement a referendum or something like that. We really made a somewhat permanent change that's very, very, very difficult to undo now, but it's implemented. But in Southern California, we have a construction company that said for every 75 people we interview, we can find about 15 who can pass the drug test. I mean, those numbers are just overwhelming. Canyon City Workforce Center says it took 2 months to find 3 commercial driver's license drivers that could pass the drug test with salaries being competitive. Some of you probably feel this pain. Another problem that we have is that people are cheating the drug test in huge numbers. One of my members in my association, he has a drug test company up in northern Denver. He gets approximately 2 boxes, and they're good sized boxes. I don't mean shoe boxes. I mean the boxes that his lab cups come in when he gets his shipments. He gets approximately 2 boxes of these cheat devices every week, taking them off people who come in prepared to cheat their drug test. one thing I want to mention to you about this is that if you are engaging in a drug test program, which I believe you should, as a deterrent, and you are using a contracted company to help you with those drug tests, I would always make sure that they are trained in how to detect a fake specimen. It's very simple, but I would also ensure that they are going to care enough to let you know if they find a substitute, an attempted substitution or dilution or something of that nature. Not all places really are trained to do that, especially if you're using some large national occupational clinics. I'm sad to say that just not all of them think about that or train their people very well. And of course, we're trying to stress that on our side where we handle the training and certification, but it's always up to that local employer as to whether or not they're going to really pay attention to these things. So as the employer, it really is your responsibility to say, look, we care about the integrity of the test. This matters to us. And if we're going to invest in this program, we want to make sure that we know what we're getting. So encourage them to know these things and take care of them. And if they need further training, reach out to me. I can help with how to do that. So let's talk about why all of this really matters, how it's different, and why we're getting some of these outcomes that we've never seen before. On the left side, you'll see what some cannabis plants looked like circa 1970s. These are photographs of a drug bust by the DEA in the 70s. And they took these photos because the size of these plants was quite shocking, of how big they had gotten and how robust they were. And we kind of giggle at this in comparison to what you see on the right side, where we really have cannabis trees of today. And now that I've been doing this presentation for a few years, the tree that you see on the right is really kind of small compared to some that are now growing. We have discovered the miracle of genetic modification in cannabis. And so we have trees that are 2 and 3 times this tall. The buds are growing exponentially bigger as well. I've been on some tours where I've seen simply the buds of the cannabis plant that are, and I am not exaggerating in any way, shape, or form. It was shocking to me to see flowers that were as tall as I am from my toes to the top of my head, and I'm 5'6". So it reminds me of something you'd see if you are old enough to remember the Land of the Lost, that prehistoric campy Saturday morning show some of us used to watch with the fake dinosaurs, and everything grew bigger. That's what some of these look like. So we now have pot plants that produce more, they're bigger, they can get a pound of material per harvest. Some of them through lighting and special technology can get 3 to 4 harvests a year. And make no doubt that people are also growing things more akin to this in the basements of their home. It's not just a couple of little plants like you see here on the left. It looks more like this. So we have to understand that when we allow 4, 5, 6, 7 plants per adult in a home based on these state laws, they're producing a whole heck of a lot of cannabis, not just enough to roll a joint. Okay. So with these products, we're seeing highest THC potencies. We used to say the cannabis plant back in the 70s, it had about 1 to 3% THC back in the days of Woodstock. And then when it was 1 to 3% THC, the CBD was also about the same amount, which means that in the whole scheme of things, the THC content was being banked or sort of what I want to say, it was a little gentler because the CBD was as powerful. That doesn't mean people didn't get high in the 70s. But when we say cannabis was sort of harmless and like a glass of wine in all of these marketing campaigns we use, maybe that might have been the case in 1972, but that's not the case in 2022, I promise you. Now we're seeing raw plant material. It got up to 10% in the 80s. In the 90s and 2000s, it was hovering between 8 and 12%. When we passed our law in Colorado, it was 12 to 15%. Now we're seeing raw plant material over 20%, significantly over 20%. Some DEA agents are telling me that in the state of Colorado, you can't find anything that's less than 25% ever. We also have new delivery systems, which I'm going to show you, and this equates to longer lasting impairment. It's not just the buzz that someone gets for 45 minutes. It's not just a 2-hour buzz. It's not just a 4-hour buzz. Now we're seeing some things that are far different. If you do not know what you're looking at on the screen right now, this is marijuana. This is one of the hottest selling, highest money producing products in states that have legalization. This is what we refer to as concentrates. There are several different names: dabs, wax, shatter, butter, earwax, oil, honey. We could go on and on. But if you do not know what you're looking at right now, that means you are out of touch with what your employees are actually taking in when they take in this drug. These potencies right here are between 60 and 90% THC. They are purified extracts that are extracted in high temperatures with butane or propane, and then they can be taken in. They used to use what is called a rig. It looked like a super bong in a sense, but now they can take these in with a vape pen, because the vape pens have been altered to be able to stand the intense high heat over 300 degrees that it requires to melt these down. Also, a vape pen that heats itself that high is at high risk of exploding, so that can cause accidents and injuries. That's a whole other presentation on the harms and risks of vaping. But let me just tell you that this product is so potent that most states have a campaign called Start Low, Go Slow. Someone who is a cannabis naive user cannot start with these products. They will cause so much damage, they could render them unconscious. So in order to protect the user, we have these public safety campaigns run by the Colorado Department of Public Health and other states' departments of health that explain that you have to build up to be able to achieve this level of use. You have to smoke so much, use so much, take in so many edibles that you can tolerate these safely, and then you can only use, one of the nicknames is dabs, a tiny little dab. So an amount that is about half the size of my tiny little pinky fingernail that you probably can't see is considered one serving. These are the products that my niece was using every day, all day, when she had her psychotic break. Now, this is a newer product that we did not have in our state when she still lived here, very, very new. I'm glad that I got her out of my state before these came to market. This is called a distillate. They are completely pure THC. Some of the products have labels that say 100% pure. We do have a couple of companies who are bragging around town that they have 110 or 120% potency. I don't know how you have potency over 100. To me, 100 is the max, 100 out of 100. But this is a product that gets an instant, immediate high. In our state, we have said that 10 milligrams is one serving. Some of these products have 60 servings in them. They're supposed to be used very sparingly. But, you know, especially if kids get a hold of them, they'll go through one of these syringes in a day or two, which is really quite terrifying. Now, I want you to notice that these are packaged in a syringe. Why is that? Well, they aren't injectable. I want to promise you that. So make sure that you understand this is not an injectable product. However, whenever you go into a dispensary and you ask the bud tender behind the counter, why is this being packaged in a syringe? What's with that? They kind of get a little gleam in their eye, and with a wink, wink, they say, you know, we're just preparing for the future. Take it as you will. So in my opinion, they're trying to prepare us for injectables in the future. Problematic with THC because it's oil soluble and not, or fat soluble, not water soluble. But at the end of the day, we have had a company in Colorado that did get an FDA cease and desist letter during the COVID pandemic, the lockdown, because they were selling injectable products to their overseas customers. So the industry is constantly trying to push the buck. And I did not get it in today's presentation, but I just had someone send me in the last couple of days something that came out week before last called Canna Bumps. If you know what a bump is, it's slang for a hit of cocaine. You need a little bump, you take a snort, right? That's cocaine lingo. And this is packaged in a little tin. It's called Canna Bumps. It comes with a little spoon for your serving size. It's snortable THC so that folks can snort it like they do their cocaine. Another thing that I want to make clear to you, these are vape cartridges. You see indica, sativa on the right, and a hybrid blend. Indica is the strain of cannabis that calms you down, chills you out, lazy. This is what you think of when you think of Cheech and Chong, the giggles. So what's the big deal about them using cannabis? They're just going to relax, sleep, and nap all the time, maybe miss work, or be a little late. That's what a treatment provider told me when I found out that my son had a cannabis problem. Was, I don't know what's the big deal. He's just going to sleep through class every now and then. Indica, we remember this because the little trade trick of remembering what indica does. Indica puts you in the couch. Okay. Sativa, however, is the strain of cannabis that amps you up, get your heart racing. This is the one that when they get super high potencies of sativa, they're going to have a higher incident of heart attack and stroke after using, if they have those underlying conditions. Sativa on these high potencies is so gets people so crazy and out of their mind when they take it, according to their own personal testimonies that they've written. They feel like they've lost touch with reality. It frightens them. And these are the types of strains of cannabis, when you get pure sativa, that you can make into a snortable product that replaces your cocaine. In fact, High Times Magazine had someone write a little blurb, like letter to the editor several years ago, that said, when I dab sativas, I get such a great high, I can actually quit my cocaine. So I guess even though cannabis does not help us with the opioid problem, maybe it will be a substitute for cocaine, but I don't think that is a comfort to any of us at any level. So when we're looking at how does this impact an employer? Well, these are products that are made for the vape pen. Do you have anything in your workplace policy that addresses vaping on the work campus? Do you know what's in the vape pen? These are two different devices. One is marketed strictly for nicotine. The other one is marketed strictly for the workplace. These are the cartridges that go inside the vape pen. One of these is pure THC. The other one is nicotine. Which one is which, and how can you tell the difference if your employee is loading up their vape pen in front of you? These are the flavor drops that make it taste like cherry, banana, strawberry, pineapple, or orange. Now, of course, on your screen, you can clearly see that the one on the left, the flavors are Yellow Brick Road and Dark Side of the Moon. So now we understand that the left side is marijuana and the right side is nicotine. However, I've heard from many employers over the years who say, I had one that was a intake director for a nursing school, and she said, my students are going out on smoke breaks, out on the patio in between classes, and they're using vape pens. And I'm telling you, when they come back in, they're acting funny. Is there any possibility that they're putting something in the vape pen other than nicotine? Well, yes, absolutely. So they had to ban vape pens in that school, but many workplaces are also now stating that they do not allow any vape devices in the workplace or on the property. Edibles are also a problem because the THC does not typically activate until it hits the liver. So that's a couple of hours later, depending on the person's metabolism. So folks could have a cannabis Pop-Tart or a brownie or whatever for breakfast, and then be affected at work later. This is one of the problems where we have states changing laws that an employer can't take action against an employee unless they can prove that the employee has used the product on the job. Well, if they're consuming right before they leave work, and then the product will not even activate until they're safely inside the walls of the building, this is a clear problem. These products come in every way, shape, size, form, brand, teas, coffees, salsas, granolas, as you can see. Anything that you can imagine can have THC in it, and they're very hard to spot because they look like every other food product. I want to take a quick moment, speaking of products that come in every size, shape, and form, to mention CBD and where we are with that and what that looks like. So here we have products that are being offered all over the country. You can find them in not only your pharmacy, but you can find them at the local gas station, although they're labeled as medicine. If any of you, I just want to say, are getting your medicine out of your local gas station, you might want to think about if you would purchase regular medication at your local gas station. So let's take a minute and just talk about how this is impacting employees. So several years ago, the U.S. Department of Agriculture made a change to hemp and how hemp is defined, and the legality of the ability to grow hemp in states that had a prohibition on cannabis. And also, this was done for the ability to study the properties of cannabis to see if there is any positive effect for potential medical use. So this was meant to make it easier to conduct studies and to find out if there are derivatives that we could extract that could have medical benefit. Because the ability to study that was pretty limited in the US at that time. Well, when that change was made, it was only supposed to apply to states that had already legalized cannabis. It was not meant to be sort of this federal legalization movement, but it de facto, that's what happened. When that law was changed, the cannabis industry said, hemp is legal, CBD is legal everywhere, so now here are your products. And it just absolutely exploded out of control. And it is absolutely 100% not that every single product that you see on every shelf when you see it is legal. That's absolutely not the case. It's just that there's so much of it that is, it's so prolific that there's no point in even trying to get control of it as far as local law enforcement is concerned, because also under two previous administrations, the Attorney General has issued stand-down orders to law enforcement not to prosecute anything pertaining to cannabis that isn't a federal offense. So law enforcement hands are tied. There's really not a lot they can do about this if they see illicit CBD on the shelf of your gas station. Also, if you haven't picked up on it yet, I would highly recommend you not buy that out of the gas station. Okay, so what we have is we have this massive market that went into play really overnight. It just happened so quickly. But in study after study after study, including studies by the FDA, we've seen there's massive fraud in this market. So we have in over 600 samples tested, most that claim to be THC free and CBD only were rich in THC with little to no CBD in them. And those containing CBD had on average less than 0.1%. And that's significant because most of these products claim to be 100% CBD. So all of a sudden, people think that this is the greatest thing on God's earth. It will solve everything. There's nothing it can't cure. You hear claims that it cures cancer, it cures MS and everything. And the reality of it is there is no medical evidence. There's no scientific evidence. Even the pharmaceutical product that we've seen, Epidiolex, to help children with seizures, it has limited efficacy. I also want you to understand that this product has high probability of causing liver damage. So I heard of a doctor that recommended that a guy dial back on his Tylenol because the doctor was concerned about liver damage and try using CBD. And what he did is he threw him from the frying pan into the fire, not knowing or understanding or researching that that would cause greater liver damage to the man who had some knee pain and then tested positive at work for THC. And then the employer was trying to figure out what to do with this. Also know that the greatest pharmaceutical efficacy from CBD in Epidiolex showed that the higher success product has a 1-to-1 ratio between THC and CBD. So that means when people get a hold of that product, they're still taking in equal amounts of THC. So then the question I get frequently from employers are, okay, if my employees are using these things, will CBD show up on the drug test? And actually, no, because we're not testing for it. We're not trying to see if someone has CBD in their system. We're only looking for the impairing substance, and it's usually the metabolized impairing substance of THC. So we're not testing for that, but we would get the THC, which likely would show up eventually. So a lot of people will ask me, this happens on a regular basis. They'll say, hey, Jo, I want to try this CBD product for, my hurt shoulder, my tendonitis, my elbow, my this, my that, my migraines. In my circles of friends and family, the young people don't ask for my permission, but some of the older folks will come to me and say, I really want to try this. Everyone else is using it. I want to see if it'll be a solution, but I'm not going to do it unless you give me your blessing, right? So I recently had an elderly couple that asked me this question. And so what I said to them was this. I said to my friend Sharon, okay, your husband Dick wants to try this for his hurting shoulder. I get it. I understand it. Everyone's telling you this will solve the problem. Dick is retired. He doesn't have to go to work every day. So that's something that's good. I would really highly recommend Dick not drive when he's taking the CBD product because we don't know what's in it. I would also recommend that you do some self-drug tests. And I recommended some home tests that I find reliable. Not all are. I didn't send her to the local pharmacy because they really can take advantage of you. I said, here's some home drug tests I would recommend. Buy them in bulk and have Dick test himself about every 3 or 4 days to see when the THC will show up. And then Dick isn't working, Dick's retired, as long as he's not driving and he's staying home. Maybe Dick wants to use this. However, here's another issue. We've seen over and over and over again in the state of Colorado, elderly senior citizens who have trip and fall injuries and they end up in the emergency room. Here we had a grandma who had grandkids in her house. She tripped over one of the toys. She broke her leg. She was transported to the emergency room by EMS services, and they saw the broken leg. As standard procedure is to conduct a drug test. Grandma was using CBD. Grandma was under the influence of THC. And so as soon as that drug test came up positive, the insurance company said, not our problem. We can't help you. This is a cash only situation, and they would not cover her injuries. You may also find out with your employees if they have an accident or injury where there's THC involved, depending on insurance coverage. So we may want to take a look at that. So to my senior citizen friends, I said, is it going to become impaired by a CBD tea or tincture or oil or whatever? It all seeps into the body. Let's test. Let's find out when he's going to test positive, then go to a lab and find out how much he's testing positive for. And then is he safe to operate in his home in a way that he will not injure himself and cause himself a very expensive accident or problem. So what I'm saying here is buyer beware. We don't know what we don't know. These products are not safe. They are not overseen by the FDA. Labeling is false. And so enough of that. You can ask me more questions on that if you need to at the Q&A. All right, so let's talk about some quick information on what you need to know, and then we'll get into what an employer can do. First of all, some of you may already know this, but I just want to stress 9% of full-time employees are illicit drug users, 13% of part-time. This is in your workplace. 10% seems to always bear out no matter what type of job you have. 10% is 10%. Substance abusers are 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim. Roughly 35% of industrial injuries take place in the US involve drugs or alcohol. They're 33% less productive on the job. We have higher absenteeism. Also, I want to say we have higher rates of presenteeism, which is a new term we're all using. Full-time workers that were interviewed that use illicit drugs between the ages of 18 and 49 self-report. This is in self-reporting to SAMHSA that they've worked for 3 or more employers in the past year, voluntarily left an employer in the past year, were fired by an employer in the past year, have taken unexcused absences in the past month, requested early dismissal or time off. Sometimes they were absent for up to 8 days without calling in. Some employers consider this job abandonment. Some say, as long as you call and let me know within 3 days, I don't want to lose an employee, so I'll let you get away with it over and over and over again. 44% said I've sold drugs to other employees. That's 44%. 64% said drugs adversely affect my job performance and I know it. This is not a surprise. 18% say I've stolen from coworkers to support my drug habit. I want you to understand that 40% of all industrial fatalities take place in the workplace because of employee substance use. And again, remember, those are fatalities, not simply the accident and injury. When it comes to employee marijuana use, we do see 55% more industrial accidents, 85% more injuries, and 75% more absenteeism than we do compared to other drugs of abuse. So this is not a harmless substance that doesn't impact anybody. And I also want you to understand there's a cost. Employee drug use overall, substance use costs the US over $246 billion per year in lost revenue. Small businesses, if you're a small business owner, can lose up to $7,000 a month in lost productivity, employee turnover, absenteeism, and tardiness. This is the lowest amount that I could find in studies possible. I did not want to give you exaggerated or inflated dollars. I try to stick to the most conservative, but we do have studies that show this number could be as high as 12,000 for one business. Most of you that own a business aren't bean counters. You're not looking at how your people problems are affecting your bottom line and whether or not those people problems are drug problems, but it all shakes out in the end. And so now that you know this, hopefully it will help you make some better decisions. So let's now get into some basics about policies. What can you do? How can you react? And how can we have a better, safer, healthier workplace in light of this information? The first thing that I want you to understand is if you are in a city, a state, or a country where we've had conversations about medical marijuana. The US has cannabis listed as federal Schedule 1 by the DEA for very specific reasons. In the raw plant material, raw cannabis, which all of these products fall under the category of raw cannabis because they're not in pharmaceutical form. Okay, the only one that has been approved is Epidiolex for children with seizures. That's the only one that is different and is a prescription. There is a synthetic called Marinol. It's not used very much because people don't want to use actual Marinol. They want to use bud. So when we look at these massive products that are all over our country, these products that are derivatives from raw cannabis have found to have a high potential for abuse. We used to say 1 in 6 became addicted. Now they're saying 1 in 3 developed cannabis dependence disorder, which was something that was classified in the 1980s once THC potencies got over 5% as a real risk. Now we're seeing 1 in 3. 1 in 3 children and adults who use these high potency products will develop cannabis dependency disorder or addiction. So high potential for abuse. 2, there's a lack of any accepted medical use in the raw plant. That means in study after study after study, academic studies over 30 years, we're not finding a place where raw cannabis has a healative property. This doesn't mean it cannot be a mild analgesic in the moment when you're high and it dulls your pain receptors. That doesn't have healative property. That means dulling or numbing pain in the moment. But as far as a healing agent, no evidence. There are no accepted safety standards for use under medical supervision. What does that mean? Well, this goes along with the last point, which means we're unable to regulate dosing standards. So let me explain that. We can take a mother plant of cannabis that produces seeds, and we can have this one plant, and let's say that plant is 10% potency for sake of argument. We can take those seeds and we can plant a crop. Let's say we do 6 plants from the seed bank. All right, that's really not how we're producing cannabis these days. We're taking clippings and cuttings, but we're just going to use this for example. So we take these 6 plants that we have taken from the same mother plant, and what we're going to find, cannabis is very unstable in its natural format, highly, highly unstable. And we have studies that show this again for decades. New Zealand has done an intense amount of study on this, as has Germany, and even England. We've had some tremendous university studies on this, as well as the University of Alabama. So you have these 6 plants, okay? And what you're going to find is you're going to find different potencies in each one of these plants. They're not all going to be 10% because the mother plant was 10%. You could have 6, you could have 10, you could have 12, you could have 13, you could have 8. It's going to be all over the map, all right? But then let's take one of these plants, and we're going to stick with our 10% plant again. Not every piece and part of that plant is going to be 10%, it's going to be all over the map. But as has been done in the past, let's say we just grind up the whole thing, roll it up. We're going to talk about smoked cannabis right now with raw plant material instead of all the crazy wacky things I've shown you. Let's just talk about some weed in a joint. Let's take a little study group of 10 people for a 10% plant material, and we're going to dose each of them with this to see what the outcomes are, to study this so that we can understand how it reacts and what is the dose dependent amount that gets this outcome, like we do with a glass of wine, right? If you're drinking a glass of wine with dinner, we pretty much know how it impacts you if you're a man, a woman, how much you weigh, whether or not you've eaten and have food on your stomach, how long it's going to impact you. Can you drive? Should you not drive? We know this, right? However, with cannabis, we get our 10 study subjects, and we're going to get different reactions from everybody. We're not going to get the same reactions we have different metabolisms, we have different body fat content because it's oil soluble, remember? And so it goes in the fat cells. It doesn't metabolize in the same way that alcohol does. We're going to have a different high for our 10 subjects. We're going to have a different lasting impairment for our 10 subjects. We don't have anything that's standard. And even if those 10 people, we bring in 10 doppelgangers that have the same height, the same weight, the same body fat content, even the same resilience to whether or not they've used cannabis in the past, we're going to get 10 more different outcomes. So we have nothing stable, nothing that gives us dose-dependent science that tells a doctor or physician, if you prescribe this X amount, you're going to get this X outcome. Therefore, we know what's safe, what's not safe, and how it's going to react. We can't do that. Therefore, cannabis remains Schedule 1 because we can't contain it down. But now think of the fact that that was in the raw plant. Now that we have the concentrates, the oils, the dabs, the waxes, now we have the edible products, now we have the vaped products and the all of these things that I'm showing you. Now we keep adding. We're not just talking about 10% potency, we're talking about 20, 30, up to 90 and 100. Now it's even harder to determine these things. So we're not getting closer to dose dependent amounts. We're getting further away, and this is getting harder and harder to detect impairment. Why does this matter to the workplace? Well, because this is why medical marijuana is not a prescription. Anywhere that has medical marijuana in the US, There is no such thing as a valid prescription. Medical doctors are prohibited from prescribing Schedule I drugs because there's no amount that they can prescribe safely. There's no instructions. There's no contraindicators for other drugs. How will this impact if you're taking medication for your blood pressure? Right? Are you already prone to stroke and heart attack based on your medication? Well, let's add some pot into there and then make the doctor liable for what they gave you. That we don't have any of that information. So we don't have valid prescriptions in any state for medical marijuana. Therefore, there's no such thing as a valid prescription, meaning it is not HIPAA compliant. So when you're in the workplace and someone flashes you their medical marijuana card, they're just saying, I use pot, and you don't have to take that under HIPAA considerations. Now, I do have to tell you there are a couple of little exceptions here. That they're kind of like exceptions that aren't really exceptions, and yet they are. And I know that just sounds crazy, but this whole situation around legal marijuana is crazy. So there are a couple of states now that have insisted on writing the word prescription into their state laws, and they've insisted that that term be used, and they've insisted that doctors write prescriptions, and they're also insisting that medical review officers, they have to look at a failed drug test, consider a prescription in their state a valid medical excuse. This puts doctors in jeopardy because they're not allowed to do that under federal law or under their licensing board. So how most doctors in those states are choosing to handle that is they will just attach a note of safety concern. But it's terrible when a state law is trying to force a doctor to do something that is completely illegal under the American Medical Association and their licensure board. So, but at the end of the day, in most states where you live, this is not a valid prescription, and you do not have to treat it as such. Okay. I also want you to understand workers who are not in a drug testing program have substance use rates 50% higher than those who are in a program. So drug test programs do work, and we've seen huge success in a number of drug testing programs that have been mandatory over the decades. Positivity rates are like 1 to 3% instead of 10 to 25%. So these things do work. And if you see literature and information on the internet that says they don't, that is usually supplied by a pro-cannabis researcher, lobbyist, paid program ad, and not valid information. So what can employers do? Well, plan, prepare, be ready to prevent. This is about a culture of safety. This is looking at, can this situation, these changing state laws in my state, bring workplace violence into my workplace? You have to be prepared for all of your workplace safety program and how to respond. Actively engage in progressive safety programs that I just are robust. That's the best thing that I can tell you. Make sure that you're addressing mental health in the workplace. Don't turn a blind eye to addiction. I'm going to get a little bit more into this in a second, but I also want to say, don't think that your employees are only using Friday night on their own time and that it doesn't matter or impact you. We have a study that was done decades ago. We actually have another one that's been done recently where pilots smoked a cannabis cigarette, got behind the flight simulator, crash. And ultimately what we discovered is that they found themselves 24 hours later with low potency cannabis. They found themselves feeling impaired 24 hours later. And most of them said that I have no impact. I feel great. This did not affect me. Again, that's old school weed. So don't ignore this. Understand that boundaries work. Even in Colorado, we have companies that have kept their policies intact. They've enforced their policies, and they say, we don't have a problem in our workplace because the community understands if you want to work in this job, it's a drug-free workplace environment. But we send that message. That's our company culture. We see that again in a utility company that said the same thing. We had to adjust our policies to make sure that people understood them and they were clear and that they knew that violations were not going to be tolerated. And in this way, they don't apply if they don't want to be drug-free. and we get the people who do want to be drug-free. So we've kind of let the culture run away with us a little bit, and kind of teach us that we have to give into it. And the reality is those that have remained firm are not having some of the issues that those who change their policies and sort of go with the flow. Employers can hold the line. They have an opportunity to teach boundaries. There should always be zero tolerance for working buzzed, stoned, or under the influence in the workplace. The message should be drugs and safety don't mix. And our policy is not necessarily about drugs and alcohol. Our policy is about safety. And that's the message that needs to be sent. This is a safety policy, right? Keep your policies intact and enforced. While we do have to take a look at state laws, and I'll mention that in a moment, there's no reason just to let this go and just throw your hands up in the air and say, I give up. It's not as hard as you think it is, especially if you have a culture of safety first. And that's what your policy does. It creates your company culture. But you must continuously educate your employees to these issues. They need to understand the risks involved, because most of them don't. What they're hearing are the campaign slogans and promises that the massive cannabis industry, which is Big Tobacco 2.0, is selling them in order to sell more product, not the safety messages that are true and accurate. It's also your responsibility to protect the vulnerable employees in your workplace who choose not to use drugs from those who do. And that's listed in the Safe and Drug-Free Workplace Act as an employer's responsibility. And so I just want you to remember that. So let's talk about solutions. So I already mentioned workers who are not in a drug testing program have substance use rates 50% higher than those who are. Let's remember that. Keep safety first. I want to reiterate that before we get into policies. So I want you to understand that employers have the perfect opportunity here to set boundaries. I want you to remember that your drug education should be a priority for any and all safety sensitive employees, even your non-safety sensitive. I hear a lot of employers in this day and age who are really parsing out, well, these people are safety sensitive, these people are not. So my question to you is, which one of your employees can be under the influence at work? Which one of your employees, is it okay for them to come to work stoned, high, drunk, buzzed, get high on their break, or be under the influence? While that may sound preposterous to you, there are people who say that this is not a problem for some workplace positions. Truly and honestly, there are those advocating that some of your workforce should be able to be under the influence at work, and it's not your problem. So ask yourself, in the world of ridiculousness into which we have entered, which one of my employees can be high? Now, if you can't think of any, then all of those position descriptions fall under your safety program, and we need to have protocols that protect them. And it's not just safety sensitive in the manner of like they could fall off of a scaffold. There's also security sensitive. There's customer service sensitive. Like, is this a person dealing with the public, representing your company, your financial information? So we have to think of this in very broad terms and how inclusive it should be. Review your policies annually at a minimum and make sure that you're covering what's new and trending right now, like fentanyl, right? Is that a substance that you need to say, if you're under the influence of this substance, we have a problem? So get educated about drug use trends, know about the contemporary products so that you fully understand what should be in your policy or what you should watch out for, or how you train your supervisors to detect those signs and symptoms. Does your policy address vaping? Does it address edibles? Does it address pills, prescription or non-prescription, or illicit use of prescription drugs? These are things that should be a part of your policy. Know that your drug and alcohol policy will hold up in a court of law. It's a document that has been proven over and over and over again to hold up in court, but it must be current, it must be actively enforced, and it must be known to the employees. In other words, this can't be a document in a file cabinet somewhere that you have to go digging for it. Nobody knows what it says. The employees have never heard of it. And then surprise, we have drug test policy only when something bad happens. It can't go down that way. You need to train all your employees on the policy. They need to be educated, understand what it's about and what the consequences are. And you should do that on a regular basis. So for instance, you can have an annual safety meeting, you can cover the policy, you can have a sign-in sheet showing that they attended. You can have a signature sheet from the back page of the policy showing that they attest to you, that they have read it and agreed to it. And then if anything happens and you go to court, you say on these dates over these 6 years, we trained everybody. I have showing that this employee attended these trainings. I have this signature sheet showing that they agreed to these policies. And then the liability is on the employee and not on you. Okay. I suggest that you use an MRO, a medical review officer, to verify test results from your drug test. A medical review officer can also order fit for duty tests. If an employee has a valid prescription for an opioid, and they can say, nope, I've got a prescription for that Xanax or Adderall or oxycodone or whatever, sometimes all of them. I've seen that plenty. And I have a valid prescription, and therefore I can have all these drugs in my system, and my failed drug test actually becomes now a negative drug test because I have these prescriptions. But you as the supervisor say they may have valid prescriptions, but let me tell you, they are not behaving in a safe manner for the job duties that they have. You let the MRO, the medical review officer, know, look, we still have a safety concern here. We have a problem. And so that medical review officer, because they can deal with all the HIPAA issues, they can take those prescriptions and say, you know what, employee, we're going to require a fit for duty test to make sure that you're safe to operate under the influence of all of these prescriptions. And I've seen employees who said, okay, let's do it. And they work with the prescribing physician and come to realize they've been overprescribed and they're overusing, and we can wean this down and get them operating safely and get them going in a way that's good for them. I've also seen employees who say, you know, none of your business. I want my drugs. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And, leave me alone and stop bothering me. And then they end up getting hurt or injured or sometimes losing their jobs just based on what the situation is. So keep that in mind, that a medical review officer is a tool in your toolbox. And if you don't know how to find someone, usually it can be through your drug testing company or your lab that does your drug test and gets your results. There's a lot of ways to find a medical review officer. Again, if you need help with that, you can let me know. More about your policies: comply with your state laws. Currently, regardless of what the news or Dr. Google may tell you, there is no state that has completely banned drug testing entirely, although there are some who have restrictions and some who have severe restrictions. There are also ways that you can enforce your policy depending on how your policy is written and to whom it applies. So don't just give up the ghost when you hear your major news network say, well, the state of New York's banned drug testing for everybody. You can just forget about it. Just stop doing it. That's not true. It is strict, but there are provisions for anybody who has safety sensitive position descriptions, and we can work through those things. Some attorneys, the workplace attorneys, are familiar with drug testing, some are not. So if you need to consult an attorney who is versed in drug testing, my industry can help you with that if you need to talk to someone who can tell you what is and is not allowed. Again, remember, this is about safety. So this is a safety policy and a culture of safety. And then remember to communicate consistently. I know I keep reiterating some of these points, but they're important and they're valuable. Never discriminate. Most state laws that are addressing employers' rights or the workplace in some way, shape, or form say employers are not allowed to discriminate, but then they don't define that. And believe it or not, a lot of those states are saying, well, we don't know what the definition of discrimination means, but we'll let you know when we find out. What that means is they're waiting for someone to get sued and then they'll decide what discrimination is. So what we say in our industry is, let's look at ADA, let's look at EEOC, and let's follow some of those best practices. Do they apply? No, but they're best practices and they're case law. And so let's take a look at them and let's say, This is probably a good roadmap for what will help an employer to not get sued. So first of all, don't ask someone about their medical marijuana card. Don't request that they show it to you. Don't ever treat anybody differently that has a quote medical marijuana card than someone else. You can't fire them just for having that card or showing it to you ever. There has to be some performance issues or behaviors that indicates they're not operating in a safe manner, for you to take some action that can be documented. All right, so these are things that we want to make sure that we're following in line with. And then I want to say you can enforce your policy with a robust drug and alcohol testing program as long as you're doing it in the right way, complying with your state laws. And for like 95% of the states out there, you're not encumbered in any way. However, best practice in this day and age, and this is extremely important in the whole scheme of things, train every supervisor on the signs and symptoms of substance abuse. Make sure that all of your frontline supervisors that work with employees, whoever has their eyes on the employees at the moment, knows what the signs and symptoms of substance use are, and abuse and intoxication and operating under the influence, so that they can clearly say something's not right. We had dilated pupils, we had constricted pupils, we had someone that had an unsteady gait, we had someone that couldn't remember questions that were asked 2 minutes ago, 2 minutes later. These are the signs and symptoms that would indicate a test needs to be done for cause or reasonable suspicion. And according to federal law, that is all that is needed to conduct a drug test for reasonable suspicion. I must tell you, never call a reasonable suspicion test a random test. It is not a random. It's not been performed under random draw situations where you have a group of people that was randomly selected in a scientific manner. If you try to single out one person and say this is a random test, and their attorney can prove that you didn't do a random draw in which their name just happened to come up and you didn't test the whole group, then you are going to be guilty of discrimination and lying about the reason for that test. So protect yourself and don't do something that sounds good but is a very bad mistake. Okay, that will invite lawsuit and you'll lose. Always follow your workplace drug and alcohol policy. Don't go off script. Be consistent. And if you don't like what it says, then change what it says before you have an incident. And then make sure whoever is supposed to respond to that policy knows how to do that. It doesn't have to go try to find the policy at the time the incident occurs. Make sure that you are approaching these issues with compassion and kindness in your enforcement, because you're looking to find someone that you care enough about to keep them safe and to send them home at the end of the day with all of their fingers and toes in a manner in which their loved one sent them to work in the morning, and also not having committed an incident where they brought harm to themselves or someone else. Just remember, you can never bring a person back to health if you ignore this problem. How can we ease this burden of the unemployable? I suggest allowing second chance programs, but there should be structures in place for accountability. Follow-up testing, see a substance abuse professional, use your EAP program, have an evaluation to determine, do they have a substance use problem or did they just make a mistake? Hire and retain people in recovery who have accountability. Support recovery and treatment programs, and don't wait for an impairment test because we don't have one. There is currently no test whatsoever on the market that measures impairment for all of the reasons I've told you before, and we are light years away from such a test. What we do have are fairly recent use tests with lab-based oral fluid that can help us, which I highly recommend, but that's the closest thing we have right now. Stay consistent. Don't think if I just hire people that don't look like they're on drugs, they don't have a drug problem. Remember the list. The school teachers are using, doctors are using, everyone's using. And again, communicate. I've covered a lot of this. So the one thing I'll say is at the end of the day, this is about taking care of people. I know that we need to protect our workplace and our interest in that, and how we support ourselves, our lifestyle, and our employees, but you are dealing with the human resource, the human factor. And before we get into Q&A, I just briefly want to tell you that I have expertise in this area from over 12 years of being in workplace drug and alcohol testing myself. But I also have this issue in my family, as you know. These are my three children that are now grown. They're now 27, 30, and 33. But my middle son, Jordan, my high achieving, gifted, straight arrow son, was the one that I found to have a drug problem when he almost took his life. And his brother found him hanging in his bedroom closet in the middle of the night. It was at the hospital when the social worker told me we needed to talk about my son's marijuana problem. And I was utterly shocked and in denial. I could not comprehend that that was my kid. There was no way. There was nothing that ever indicated to me, because I didn't know what I didn't know at the time, to be honest with you. Now I know, and I think I would have spotted it, but at that time I didn't. This culminated in, after a couple of years of trying to go through treatment after treatment after treatment program, and then return to drug use, always marijuana, marijuana, marijuana. I had to kick him out of my home and put him out on the street, and he became a straight person. He lived on the street for several years, went to another state, went up and down the coast of that state. It was later, after a couple of years of this lifestyle, I thought I had lost him time and time again. I had planned out his funeral because I was certain that's where he would end up. He decided to try to get a job. And a guy that was needing a forklift operator told my son, if you can pass a drug test, I will give you a chance. My boy got clean. My boy got the job as a forklift operator on the opposite coast to which he had traveled during his stint of homelessness. And then a couple of years later, he returned home to clean up his life and get everything back in order. And he's now a computer programming student with a job with a major provider in the US. He has a little girl, he's a father, and I still have my son with me because of a workplace drug test. So this issue matters to me on a personal level, not just a professional level. So all of that having been said, I threw an awful lot at you. I would love to hear your questions and have any further discussion that you'd like to have. So Karen, do you want me to stop sharing my screen at the moment?
That'll be fine.
Okay. Here's my contact information if anybody wants it. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so we have a question. This is a more specific. It says, what do you know, if anything, about Hound Labs cannabis breathalyzer? Maybe that's a new, or other cannabis breathalyzer products. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, I'm very familiar with Hound Labs. They're members of my National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association. They have a prototype product that it's actually microscopic saliva measurement. It's being called a breathalyzer because they do capture that saliva by blowing many breaths into this device over a short period of time. They are promising that they can pick up use or active THC in the saliva, which saliva, or some people refer to it as oral fluid, is the same thing. That's the closest bodily fluid that we have to blood test measurement for active THC. So currently a lab-based oral fluid test can detect that THC within about 8 to 24 hours of use. So you could say, well, I got this test, that means they've used within the last 8 to 24 hours. Some are saying 6 hours to 24 hours. And it's not detecting use what do I want to say, after that time or before that window of time. So we can narrow it down. Hound Labs is saying they've got it down to 4 hours. So they're saying if you have someone who takes this test, beyond a shadow of a doubt within this 4-hour window, that's when we have it. Initially, they were calling that an impairment test, but it does not measure impairment. It's just a recent use test, which we're very excited about. Again, it's in prototype phase. They're trying to get it to market. They're hoping that they'll have it to market within the first quarter of 2023, from my understanding. But at the end of the day, it's showing you that your employee has used recently, not measuring impairment. But you know what? We're getting closer to saying, hey, you've used within this window of period, instead of, as some complain about, weeks. So that's good news. So at the end of the day, it will be kind of like a tabletop device. If you think about when computers first came out and they took up entire rooms, and then we finally got them down to a desktop, and now we hold them in our hands. It's kind of similar, right? So you have a desktop device. Eventually, maybe we'll have a handheld device, or something smaller, but that's where the technology's got. And there's actually a few devices that are coming to market that are very similar. So it'll be exciting to see what happens in the future.
Okay, we have another question. This person has asked why it is that some people test negative even though they've admitted using marijuana like the previous evening.
Because when we drug test someone, it has to metabolize into their system. So usually, for instance, when you do a urinalysis, you're testing the metabolized property. It's not the active drug. So if you want the active parent drug, you want to take a look at another test method. Again, I believe in lab-based oral fluid for cannabis strongly. There are a couple of great products out there. You can look to Quest Diagnostics. You can look to OraSure Technologies for some really good product. Lear has Abbott Laboratories, I should say, has a really great product. But if you're doing your analysis, that's going to take time to metabolize through the system. And so if you drug test that person right out of the gate, you're going to get a negative drug test, particularly if they don't have the THC built up in their system. And the good news there is, what that means is this is likely not a regular user that maintains a level of THC in their body. So in that regard, you have some really good news, is that they're an occasional user, or maybe perhaps a first-time user. But if you give it another 24 hours and do the drug test, then you'll get the positive. Now, that having been said, if this is the case, first-time, one-time user, 2 days, like when you get to the third day after that use, it's going to be not detectable again. There's a misperception that it'll test positive for 30 days. It's not true. The 30 days come from when someone is fully saturated with THC because they've been a long time chronic user, and they decide to cease use, and they're like, okay, I want to get this really good job, so I got to quit so I can test clean. Then it could take 30, maybe even 60 days for that THC to get out of their body, depending on their metabolism and body weight and all of that. At a one-time user, you're going to capture it from about 24 to 48 hours, and then it'll be out.
Okay, we have another question, and this is in regard to the impact of marijuana on mental health. And some people say that it helps with their depression. So what are your thoughts on that?
Cannabis actually contributes to depression. What we have is that analgesic effect I mentioned, where someone in a moment can numb out to the pain that mental health issues cause them for a moment. And then when that moment is over, it can exacerbate and in fact multiply mental health conditions. This is one of the scary things about these high potency products. When I say it can exacerbate mental health conditions, my niece and hundreds to thousands of other young people who have gotten caught up in this, they hear voices, they see hallucinations, they get really caught up in obsessive behavior, often over religious iconery. Sometimes it's sex and sexual identity. There's I shouldn't say identity, but definitely I don't want to get too far off track here, but rehabilitation centers are telling me that they're like, we can spot someone who's been using marijuana a mile away because they get obsessed, like it's like this obsession with sex and issues around it, or religion, or that aliens are chasing them, or the mob is after them. Very, very paranoid, and it always has to do with being attacked and persecuted. So anyway, at the end of the day, for depression, not the answer. It's a temporary relief where you can zone out for a moment, but not only is it going to harm in the long term and create more depression, if they're also taking any prescription medications for mental health issues or depression, they're going to have problems there as well. So just not the solution for depression, actually something that will increase it and make it worse.
Okay, another question. Do you recommend companies halt pre-employment testing?
This is a tricky one, and I know that some states are really limiting pre-employment testing, and it can be so distressing that states are dictating what an employer can and cannot do for workplace safety, especially when these are political decisions and not based on any fact. But I don't suggest you do that unless your state law has changed. And then if your state law has changed, there's some things you need to put into place, right? So what you're doing is telling an employee, we're not going to drug test, we're going to let you in the door, but then we're going to hold you accountable if there's an accident or injury pertaining to substance use that you caused. So you're giving them a mixed message. And then are you going to do a random test program or not? Are you going to communicate that to them or not? Then are you going to do post-accident testing if they do cause an accident or injury, so that you as the company don't incur all of the liability and culpability for whatever damage is caused? So when we don't do pre-employment testing, we're sending a mixed message and we're confusing people. We're actually seeing that it drops the company morale, because employees feel like it's a bait and switch. They feel like you're letting me in the door and telling me I can do whatever I want, but now you're changing the rules and telling me something different. So in order to avoid having a morale problem over your drug test policy, you need to communicate very clearly. What I would suggest, again, I don't suggest eliminating the pre-employment drug test, but I will say I understand the pain that is causing us in some areas. So maybe they can reapply again in 30 days. Maybe if they fail the drug test, you give them 30 days to retest, contingent with their employment, contingent upon a test in 30 days to see where they're at. Maybe you say to them, you're going to have this opportunity, but then you're going to go in the random pool, and this is what we expect moving forward, but we want you to have this opportunity. You just have to understand, if you don't pre-employment drug test and that's your window of training, you may have someone that just can't comprehend the training program because they can't retain the information, and so it could take longer to train them and get them acclimated to the job and productive. So it presents a world of challenges when we drop or delay drug testing, but I would not eliminate drug testing altogether, and pre-employment drug test if you can. But send a message that if you fail your drug test, we'd like you to come back 30 days from now and try again.
Very good. Okay, well, we have reached the end of our webinar this morning. We want to thank you so much, Jo. You just have given us so much information and so much food for thought, so to say. So thank you. And just want to remind, we're going to invite all of you to our future webinars. We have another webinar on recovery in the workplace that is going to be on Thursday morning, so in 2 days. From 11 to noon Eastern Daylight Time. And you're welcome to sign up for that if you are not already. And also, we will be sending you information about the International Society of Substance Use Professionals, and how, if you are a substance use professional, you can sign up for this. We have a workplace-based prevention work group that you can also become part of. And finally, just watch for that survey, and the certificate recording and PowerPoint will be emailed probably early next week. So thank you so much, and thank you for attending. And this concludes our webinar.